you all have been working together on deploying AI for the SKU groups, for automatically proliferating them and covering your entire inventory. That's a pretty rad and important project as it gets to automated ordering. Like, talk about that workflow between you and like things that we learned and things we
Yeah.
figured out.
Yeah. So I can just kick it. So do Danny, if you really quickly, I'm gonna hold you on this. Just mimic that flow again that you were doing on the screen right
Yep.
now, by
So do the
clicking
pre-rolls. Yeah,
pre-rolls.
so I'm gonna go pre-rolls. I'm gonna go to a brand, right? So I got a category, I got a brand,
Yeah.
I got a weight, right? Because so many of these products are weight based, right? So it needs to be
Mhm.
1 gram. And then I was doing
You have a
infused,
search
right?
term.
A
Yeah.
search term for infused. So here you go.
Exactly, right? And so what you can see here is like throughout that, right? If you just basically look at like the pills at the top of the screen here, right? So what are we talking about? We're thinking of like how can we iterate through all of your inventory and say, okay, if we go by category, if we go by brand, if we go by weight, right? If we look at price buckets potentially, we're always still running into sort of this issue that a lot of folks bring up that you probably deal with was, well, even if I get down to my Oz cannabis pre-rolls, I'm dealing with my Oz cannabis infused pre-rolls, my Oz cannabis multi-pack pre-rolls, my Oz cannabis sleep CBD pre-rolls or whatever they are, right? Like, and that complexity is made very difficult in cannabis specifically because then when you go back to the distributor, you're dealing with the fact that they have dozens of different strains, and every single month they're coming up with new ones, right? And so if you're trying to go product by product to figure out how many odds cannabis infused pre-rolls are, if you pull how much you've of all the ones you've ever sold, you're dealing with hundreds of products of which not that many are actually available, right? So what we're in the process of right now you saw how Danny had to click and manually click those buttons and click those things to do it, right? Ultimately, what we're doing is we are training an AI model to be able to find those buckets for you, right? So at launch with Happy Cabbage, we can take an AI model, right? And we can essentially auto group the inventory into these types of things, looking at product names in order to extract that information, like is it infused, is it not infused, and all that kind of stuff. And we are using that with some of the state of the art AI technology out there today. We've been reviewing multiple different modeling techniques from Google, from Anthropic, from OpenAI, and we're actually developing a workflow where essentially we're layering the data and learning on top of those AI models under the hood. And Cobb, if you want to talk a little bit about why that's really interesting, specifically about how we're doing it, because honestly, some of the way of using these AI models in production at that scale that we're talking about, just because they're very new, hasn't necessarily been done yet. And so some of this is actually very cutting edge work in terms of like actual applications of AI embedded into the actual systems that we're building.
Yeah, yeah, this is all really interesting stuff. I think, if it didn't come across earlier, I spent a lot of time thinking about building and, taking these data science pipelines and converting them into, I mentioned before, anticipating the way the data needs to look, anticipating the schema and calculating it, computing it. I think what is tempting in this age of AI hype is to drop a ChatGPT chat box into an app and call your app AI enabled. I think, in the vein of what we were talking about before about the speed and the performance, wow, can we get like um, a meaningful, performant, useful tool in front of people? That kind of remains the question, right? So I think the key insight that we had, Andrew was hitting on here, is that we have structured metadata that we derive from the point of sales. It gets us really, really close to creating all these demand groups, creating these buckets that Danny keeps talking about. We have the brand, right? You saw him click on that. When I say structured metadata, you saw in the app, like Danny's clicking on the brand name. He's specifying that 1G for that 1 gram. He's specifying that this is a 1 gram pre-roll. It's classified as a pre-roll, right? Um, but we get to a point where we don't have that structured metadata. And that's where these models, I think that's kind of the key insight that Andrew made there, is that the structured metadata can take us really far, and then we can use these LLMs to kind of take us that last little bit, to that thing that a human can do really well, looking at all of the, Oz 1 gram pre-rolls and identifying, like, okay, so like, what are these? Like, how would I describe these 3 or 4 different buckets that these are? There's infused. There's the single packs, the multi packs, that the stuff that Andrew mentioned. I would go so far as to say, Andrew was saying, we're developing that model. I think, that model is developed, right? So I
Yeah.
think what is interesting for me, again, as a builder, someone who thinks about this stuff, is, again, like, making this an actual actionable, useful feature is really what I'm passionate about. And that is, what we're working on now and what we'll have available shortly, so that it is something that is, impactful and useful and meaningful, and not just, a chat box in an app, right? Which is a fun trick, but you know, doesn't necessarily get us closer to that automated ordering that is our North Star.